This really is the life, ain't it? 60 FPS, fine-grained graphical control, customizable UI. It doesn't get that much better, does it? Alex here, welcoming you to this digital Foundry analysis of the PC version of Far Cry 5. Far Cry 5's PC version is looking to be a great one, alright. So today we will be looking at the PC version's settings, scaling, and performance characteristics, as well as looking at which settings the Xbox One X version of the game matches on PC. Dunia has come a long way from its ambitious debut in Far Cry 2, and it is a developmental apex that is apparent as soon as you open up the menu and just peer ever slightly into the options in Far Cry 5. And man, aren't these just some great graphical options? From a UI and UX design perspective, this is some of the best options menu design I have seen since Gears of War 4. You have all the options categorized into submenus, with each technical grouping offering quite a lot of customizability. A lot of thought was obviously poured into making the options granular, yet transparent at the same time. Even the small things are impressive, like, have you ever started a game, cranked up everything to highest, only to find out there was one super highest setting that was hidden in the menu? Well, Far Cry 5's graphical options let you visually know how many options there are in total, per variable, so that can never happen. Disregarding all creative writing lecture, Far Cry 5 shows and tells regarding its options, as each graphical variable is furnished with an image window and accompanying text, describing its effect and showing it directly on screen. And furthermore, you can test any of these changes you make based upon an in-game benchmark. You can load it up at any time, giving you frame metrics and a final report. You are even given a lovely little graphic showing expected VRAM utilization, which is accurate for the most part, but you can see your personal metrics going above it, as I am positive the game caches data as your VRAM limits allow it. As is and should be standard, the game allows you to choose your resolution, querying windows here, showing up every single resolution from the resolution list, allowing you to choose the aspect ratio for your chosen list of resolutions, supporting 21:9 cinematic displays here as well, your refresh rate, and whether or not the game will output in HDR, something I cannot test locally at the moment, but I have heard great things about. The next menu over allows you to tweak the individual visual elements and effects in the game, the first setting of which is going to be obvious to longtime viewers of Digital Foundry, infamous to many an early next-gen console comparison, Anisotropic Filtering, or AF. So while it is nice to see this option on PC, it would be nice to see the description text saying which level corresponds with which level of AF, such as 16x for Ultra. This is an area though where I recommend all users nearly always set it to Ultra, or just globally force it to 16 times in the graphic control panel, leaving it on and just forgetting it, as I have been since 2003. The shadows option here does a variety of things, all packed into one setting. Based upon what you set, it adjusts the internal resolution of the individual cascades, moving ever downward until low. It adjusts the distance at which shadows are called from the camera, and it also adjusts the filtering, with the lowest setting having little to no filter. Settings above low here also introduce the nice poisson, disk filtering made popular in Crytek games, as well as introducing a form of umbra penumbra shadows, where shadows close to the point of casting are sharp and detailed, and become ever more diffuse the further away they move from the casting point and as the area of confusion increases. A great example here, as the tree behind me is further back and very blurry at this point, yet the stump of the tree to my camera right has a hard-edged, detailed shadow. Low shadow settings here also turn off screen space shadows, which are used to great effect on the weapon view model and on small tufts of grass in the game, which do not warrant the expensive cost of shadow maps necessarily, which otherwise are turned on the Ultra setting. Even though I'm used to seeing great leaps in performance here from turning down shadow settings in most games, FC5 is an anomaly, a point I will get to at the end of going through all the settings, but from going from Ultra to low, I only saw an increase of 5 FPS, moving from 60 at 100% GPU utilization to 65 at 100% GPU utilization. Not a great increase in performance there from going down to the lowest setting. After this, you have the geometry and vegetation setting, which pulls back both the LODs of objects closer to the camera, thus making pop-in more visible, as well as reducing the density of smaller vegetation, like tiny brush and bushes, both close to the camera and into the distance. Here is another setting where I was somewhat surprised by the differential in performance on offer from going from highest to lowest. On Ultra, I saw a scene with 61 FPS go merely to 66, even though it was dense and full of vegetation. The environment setting here is rather simple, as it only really controls the game's use and quality of screen space reflections. Here the highest settings have differing qualities of SSR, while the second to lowest setting culls its usage on all opaque surfaces, and the final lowest setting also turns it off on transparent water surfaces. Going from the lowest to the highest here, I saw a scene with 66 FPS only going down to 62 FPS, so it's also not a very expensive setting in and of itself. The water setting is a variable that is not exactly as transparent as you might think. The fidelity of water on control here is not its visual features or simulation properties, but mainly the resolution of surface texturing and sprite work, decreasing the normal map resolution as you turn it down, or decreasing the resolution of the sprites kicked up by waterfalls, for example. Here I saw a very meager uptick in FPS by going from high to low, from 57 to 60 FPS in a scene. Like water, terrain is another setting where it controls a rather small visual element, and here it would just be ground decals, mainly on roads, which are presumably rendered differently than other elements in the game and have their own setting controlling their apparent quality in the distance, a separate anisotropic filtering option that you would see in other games like Wolfenstein: The New Colossus. Moving from high to low, I only saw a difference of around 3 FPS in most scenes, so not a very large performance variable here. Volumetric fog in comparison to terrain and water is an option that does exactly what it says. It controls the quality of volumetric fog used throughout the game, never turning it off, mind you. It just adjusts the internal resolution of the grid of voxels comprising it. Since fog is temporarily filtered though, you'll see just only a bit more aliasing and less detail as the settings go lower, though it is already a very diffuse effect, so turning it down is a nice way to increase performance without much visual sacrifice. Here in a scene at the very highest setting, I saw 60 FPS at 99% GPU utilization, and then it went up to 63 FPS, turning it down to low. Anti-aliasing options are limited to just off, SMAA, which is presumably just the 1x version with no temporal pass, and an accumulation temporal AA. I recommend the temporal AA in this game as it ensures good coverage and is a tiny bit more expensive than SMAA, though it must be said at 1920 by 1080 or lower, it can look rather soft, and it definitely has problems with trails being left behind moving objects. Dialing in the Xbox One X's settings here was not exactly easy, as the game's visual options are overall very similar between presets, and the game's dynamic time of day in combination with enemy conditions and people always trying to kill me really made it a treat. But in the end, I got it! Xbox One X can be said to be running AF on high or ultra, where seeing the difference requires a large, flat, unadorned plane. Shadows are set to high and not ultra. Environment, aka SSR, is set to high in terms of features, but is slightly blurrier than the setting on PC. Geo and Vegetation is set to high, where examining the distance this log LOD'd in confirmed it matching these settings. Terrain, or AF, for many of the game's decals is set to low in comparison to PC, and volumetrics are set to low, as can best be seen in the opening scene of the game, where low volumetrics produces the same visual artifacting one can see on the Xbox One X version of the game. Overall, when changing graphics from ultra to low in total when overviewing a scene, I saw an uptick of just 22 FPS in total, from 61 FPS on average to 83 FPS on average. Usually it is not a good thing to see such a low differential in performance, moving from the highest settings to the lowest. But Far Cry 5 prioritizes many core aspects of its visual features and sets them above turning them off completely, thus maintaining effects parity across most presets. This means that your game on low will not be completely hideous, but it will also not be super performant as well GPU-wise. So if you have something like an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1070, as I've been demoing with this entire time, in terms of options you have a couple things you can do. You could crank everything up to Ultra and be content to playing at 1080p 60 FPS with 1.1 resolution scaling. Though, as a word of warning here, the in-game benchmark is good for gauging your performance target on the GPU, but you may want to scale a bit down more conservatively than it lets on. I originally had a flawless 60 in the benchmark at 1.2 resolution scaling, but going into the campaign saw me getting drops from 60 FPS during cutscene moments and during large explosions close to the camera. Another option you have on top of just turning everything up to Ultra is to turn down effects smartly to maintain visual feature set parity. Here in this game it means shadows set to normal, geo and vegetation set to Ultra, environment set to high, water set to high, terrain set to normal, and volumetric fog set to normal, which should give you the combined headroom to play at 60 FPS at much higher resolution scaling. Your last and final option is just to go for the console experience of turning up the resolution as far as you can at those settings that you find visually appropriate and locking the FPS to 30, which on a 1070 is the full fat 4K experience at ultra settings. Speaking of 30 FPS though, the last menu allows you to choose VSync from your chosen refresh rate and adjust your FOV, and the last option here allows you to adjust the internal frame rate cap, with or without VSync. But this is perhaps really the only stumbling moment in the graphical options, as the FPS cap doesn't actually work. Taking a look at its effect in the in-game benchmark when set to 30 confirms that suspicion. As you can see, frame times bouncing above and below the set targeted 33.3 milliseconds. Locking externally with Rivatuner Statistics Server sees a decided improvement over the in-game option, but one that is still not exactly perfect. Here I was only able to get that perfect, smooth frame pacing by utilizing NVIDIA's half refresh rate VSync option here for 60 Hz. In comparison to its predecessors on the Dunia engine, Far Cry 5 makes great utilization of systems offering more than 4 threads. While other games past Far Cry 3 have utilized multi-threading to a degree, they are often heavily limited by one thread for the bottom line performance you could see. Nonetheless, achieving extremely high frame rates at the highest settings is not easy or practically impossible, so getting that locked 120 or 144 FPS is going to be off the cards for 99% of users unless you have some 5.0 GHz overclocked i7 nightmare of a PC. Though getting that lock to be an actual 100% is not going to be possible in the current version of the game, unfortunately. Normal combat can proceed without a beat as explosion goes off, alpha effects fill the screen, and enemies enter the scene, yet as soon as you hop on a fast moving vehicle or just wander around zones aimlessly, you'll come to notice that Far Cry 5 has a hitching problem, seemingly as it loads in new objects. It's not huge, mind you, but it's visually distracting, and even though it just represents one bounce in the millisecond frame time for one frame, you can see it. Hitching is also dramatically increased in such moments and in the general line of play if you only have 8 GB of system RAM, as the game itself is heavy in the RAM department here as well. Here I noticed that the game is often pegged above 8 GB of RAM utilization at the highest settings. So if you have 8 GB of RAM, I recommend turning down the geometry and vegetation settings, implementing a 30 FPS cap to help swallow those problems, but still, they'll persist. Bearing this in mind, both the GeForce GTX 1060 and AMD RX 580 provided by MSI perform admirably in this game at ultra settings at 1080p, both in the in-game benchmark itself, where they do not drop below 60 FPS, or within the moment-to-moment gameplay itself, where they stay north of 60 even as things kick up and explosions are tossed around everywhere. While good at this resolution, both cards suffer at 4K, not being able to make the 30 FPS minimum at ultra settings. At my preferred optimized settings, nor at Xbox One X settings. Instead, these cards allow you to approximate a better than PS4 Pro experience by locking the game to 30 FPS and playing at 1620p at optimized, Ultra, or Xbox One X settings. Interesting to note here are the differences in GPU driver overhead, which become visible when turning down the resolution, unlocking the game's frame rate, and keeping the GPU below 100% utilization. I actually wasn't expecting such a close result between AMD and Nvidia here, but this is a Gaming Evolved title nonetheless. And that brings us to the end of this video. Far Cry 5's PC version grants the game's naturalistic visuals their highest heights and offers the ability to achieve 60 FPS should your machine be up to the challenge. Well, kind of. Along with being a great looking game, it boosts one of my favorite UI designs for a graphics menu. The developers deserve serious commendations for the little details that make it great. Performance wise, the game is kind of lacking, as the graphical options do not scale so low, and the game is riddled with little skips and stutters due to the open world streaming issue. The game on average can run very well on modest hardware, as the GTX 1060 and RX 580 show, and it can scale ultra high, beyond the consoles. So with some patching to fix up the issues I mentioned, Far Cry 5 could be said to have a near perfect PC port. Perhaps we'll visit it again sometime soon. So thank you for staying around throughout this entire video. If you do like what you saw, hit that like button, or subscribe to our channel. If you would like to discuss it with me in any form, write a comment, or follow myself or Digital Foundry on Twitter. This is Alex bidding you farewell once again, und auf Wiedersehen.